It's a great pleasure to be at the discussion today on the future role of biomass in decarbonization scenarios. In order to set the framework today, first of all, I would like to mention that the Center for the Study of Democracy is the first institute in Bulgaria that developed long-term decarbonization scenarios. In the past 2 years, we have been working with some of the leading European institutes in like Climact in developing a tool called Pathways Explorer, which aim is to model in particular decarbonization pathways. How do we get to carbon neutrality in different sectors, in the power, building sector, agriculture, forestry, and also the industrial sector and the transport sector. We have also worked together with Cambridge Econometrics, Agora Energivende, which is also a leading think tank on energy transition, and REC in Hungary. So we have developed several scenarios for decarbonization, and in particular today I will present a bit of a more ambitious scenario, which is more aligned with the Fit for 55 package. When we started developing the scenarios, like Fit for 55 was not there yet, so we developed like a policy scenario which is closer to the strategic documents like NECP, the National Recovery and Resilience Plan. So these targets in the documents are changing, as we already see constantly in Bulgaria. And we highlight some of the inconsistencies between our scenarios and the policy measures. Then we have this kind of long-term decarbonization scenario. And also we have one which is based on technological innovation and another one more on behavioral changes. Today I will focus more on this LTS central scenario, which is the one which is more aligned with the EU decarbonization targets, and in particular the Fit for 55. To start with the question, is decarbonization of the Bulgarian economy possible about 2050? The simple reply is yes, it is possible if certain elements are put in place. First of all, if we have accelerated fossil fuel phase out, renewables-based electrification, if we tackle efficiently the energy poverty problem, which is also a big security challenge, energy security challenge in Bulgaria. And this comes out also in some of our recent analysis on energy security. We're also the institute that recently launched the European Energy and Climate Security Index, where one of the components is affordability. So we found that for Central and Eastern Europe, energy poverty is a serious, actually, energy security challenge. Improving security of supply, and last but not least, strategic allocation of public funds and governance. This is also a very important component, in particular in making the carbon neutrality happen, avoiding the so-called carbon capture risks, which we already see a lot happening with mega projects in Bulgaria. So first of all, starting with the first component is this on the chart, you see the power capacity allocation in this is the LTS scenario and how this will change by 2050. One of the first components for a fast decarbonization is phasing out as soon as possible the coal power plants in Bulgaria. So accelerated coal phase out by 2030 at the latest, which should ensure better economics for the remaining fleet. The problem is that the coal fleets in Bulgaria is very old and inefficient. Only 50% of the fleet is utilized, which means if we have a policy scenario and the way it is in NECP currently, that would mean that after 2030, only basically the fleet would be even more unutilized, and that would we also calculated in another studio that 1 billion of euros annually are given to coal subsidies. So a faster coal phase out would also mean that ensure better economics also for the remaining fleet, and that the remaining power plants until 2030 are utilized at a higher rate. So, of course, the tackling the energy security issue, as I said, because of the volatility of prices. And something very important is prioritizing a fast scale up of renewables over capital intensive projects with high risk of delays and state capture. Unfortunately, we've seen even in the current version of the National Recovery Plan, there is a lot of focus on mega projects like the battery projects. In our scenarios, we come to the conclusion that battery storage would be cost effective after 2030 when costs start to fall down. And there are also certain state capture risks in projects like this. So we need to move from these mega projects to small scale projects. But in order for this to happen, we need to enforce also European legislation like completion of the liberalization of the market, the transposition and implementation of the RED Plus directive. We're lacking a lot of actually provisions on prosumers, residential and industrial net metering. So in order to scale up this level of renewable energy investments that is needed for the decarbonization, we need to enforce this like legislation in place, which in the past years has been blocked a lot also by certain oligarchic structures in the energy sector that were delaying this energy transition. As we already see, in order to fully tap into Bulgarian renewable energy potentials, I already mentioned we need to reduce the energy poverty with a focus on targeting vulnerable consumers. So we also need flexible support measures for industrial consumers to increase their energy, to cover their energy needs. For example, in the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, we don't see a long-term strategy for industrial decarbonization, and the Commission just came up with a technology roadmap, in particular for how to decarbonize the industrial sector, which needs to be implemented also at a larger scale. Also, the grid needs to be resilient and smart and interconnected in order to mitigate the security of supply risks. Also, the other thing is, as I mentioned, the scale up of renewables need to happen very fast and also at a large scale. This is according to the scenario, what you see in the graph, the electricity production per renewable energy sources and combined heat and power. We already see that wind, onshore and solar PV will play a bigger role until 2050. And also what would be decisive for the acceleration of renewable energy technology would be also using other technologies like offshore wind. We already seen that in the Bulgarian Black Sea coast, we have a potential of 4.6 gigawatts of offshore wind, for which we're currently working on advising the parliament. We already carried out a study also on the potential of offshore wind in Bulgaria. And we presented this study in the Bulgarian parliament and received the support for this from all political groups. And this is something which could actually accelerate also the decarbonization, but also removing all the legal and administrative barrier for also small scale renewables that are currently a big bottleneck, and the discriminatory treatment of TCOs and DCOs. And Bulgaria has one of the most burdensome procedures when it comes to integrating renewables to the grid. This is something to take into account. As we already mentioned, biomass, what role has biomass? First of all, it has a certain role in particular in that by 2050, the large wind power plants and biomass could become close to like playing the role of baseload capacity. And because like the need to build nuclear power plant in order to ensure a base load will decrease because of the saturated renewable energy sources, according to the LTS scenario. However, part of this will be in particularly driven by, as I say, large-scale wind, and also to a certain extent by biomass. We talk about the power sector. Well, in the building sector, we have problematic relations. We already looked at what are the drivers for reducing emissions. One of the key sector is heating and cooling. And there we see a very, a very high dependence on firewood, because if we talk about biomass in Bulgaria, it's firewood, basically. And that in order to decarbonize, we need to phase out not only in the heating and cooling coal, but also biomass and natural gas. So this will be the major drivers for decarbonization. For example, biomass needs to decrease in 2020 from 7.45 terawatt hours to 4.99 terawatt hours in 2030 and to 2.13 terawatt hours in 2050 if we want to achieve these decarbonization targets.
This is what people use in their homes, exactly what the energy poor people use. The other thing
is already that biomass is a serious factor for energy poverty in Bulgaria, because like 1/3 of the households have difficulties in warming up their homes, and they use 50% coal and biomass to heat up their homes. So what we need to reach to carbon neutrality is to replace also with electrification, district heating, and also more new technologies like heat pumps, solar collectors, and enhanced energy efficiency in the building sector. So we already see that energy demands in the LTS scenario so almost reduces by half by 2050. So this will play a bigger role. However, here the problematic is most of these consumers that are dependent on firewood are energy poor. So most of them have difficulties in covering these initial capital investments. So they cannot make it without very targeted support schemes and credit lines in Bulgaria that we currently don't have. For these consumers to get out of this vicious circle. So this is in particularly for the building sector. So this is contrary to the NECP forecast, which is currently, of course, needs to be outdated, where the renewable energy target of 27% renewable energy is not only low according to the current European targets, but it's also based on false premises of a growth of biomass from 30 to 44% in the heating and cooling sector, which is totally unrealistic currently, not only unsustainable, but also unrealistic. Because we actually see that in order to reduce emissions, we need to also reduce biomass as well, and not to grow biomass. I will come to other inconsistencies later with the AFOLU sector with regard to some of the strategic documents. The other thing to mention is, so energy poverty and also decreasing emissions goes hand in hand, not only of switching the fuels, but also energy efficiency measures. And here I would like to mention is that 90% of the building stock is not in line with the current European energy efficiency requirements. 93% of the buildings also have the worst energy characteristics, reaching class F, G, and E. So this is a serious area where we need to work in order to reduce, in particularly energy demand in buildings, because this is interrelated also to the energy consumption. This is another sector, as you already focusing on forestry and land use. There are a couple of trends here that are observed. First of all, is already we see a decline of negative emissions by 2030, which is already driven by the decreased growth of the potential of greenhouse gas removals by forests, and also other factors such as the higher average age of forests in Bulgaria and the lower rate of artificial afforestation. So this explains that by 2030, we have also a kind of decline in negative emissions. In the NECP, however, we already see the increase of negative emissions. This is in contrast first with the NECP forecasts, the current NECP, where forestry is given to be a major source of biomass in the period 2018-2027. Because of the factors I already mentioned. And another thing there, according to the NECP scenario, we see a growth of negative emissions to minus 8.3 million tons CO2 by 2050. It's not clear how we get to this increase in negative emissions. Some of the measures are mentioned, but we don't see it in policy measures. We don't see measures for afforestation, for land management, carbon sequestration. Here in the scenarios, we see that some of the biggest drivers for the emissions are the fall in crop yields, but also livestock, and particularly domesticated animals, and also land management are three of the most important factors. So in order to also reach carbon neutrality, this LTS scenario foresees that negative emissions will increase to 11.3 million tons of CO2 by 2050, which is only possible through certain land management, carbon sequestration measures and land management, for example, the conversion of surplus land to new forests or new prairies. Also, greening of urban areas and additional afforestation measures that need to happen now. However, what strategic documents need to define better is, in particular, what NECP is lacking is where would this growth in negative emissions come from? Would it come from afforestation? Would it come from carbon capture with bioenergy? These are important questions also for judging the sustainability of the measures. And finally, I just have some slides with key takeaways to wrap up. What do we need for decarbonization? Coal phase out by 2030 for better economic performance, decentralization and democratization of the power system, in particular with the focus on scaling up small-scale renewable projects, while ensuring a smart grid and also avoiding of gas lock-in in general, and in the medium and long term. And we need also to reduce the energy and resource intensity of the Bulgarian industry, and we don't see measures being taken or discussion currently in that direction. With the circular economy, electrification, and also smart industry in the buildings, we need also not only the shallow renovation that we currently see in the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, but we need a higher rate and also a depth of renovation and electrification. So we need to move to passive or to passive buildings, if we want to be carbon neutral by 2070. And for this, we also need innovative financial scheme, such as the ESCO schemes, but in other Horizon project, we also were working on another scheme, which was called Consumer Stock Ownership Plan. In particular, this was developed for vulnerable consumers in a couple of countries. The transport with low emission vehicles, and this would be actually one of the biggest challenges also, and low carbon infrastructure and disincentives for owning a vehicle. And also the decarbonization process, an opportunity to reduce energy poverty as well.
Thank you,